So it's nice to see so many of you on this call. I'm Kathy Fenter, Grady, you may know me as now, and I live here in Milton, Ontario. So just want to acknowledge with gratitude and appreciation that the land that I live on is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Crest First Nation. And I've been here in Milton and in Canada for about 26 years. And I would like to just share with you some basics about the WHO code. And this is in response to so many requests to do some synthesis of a very complex topic and bring it down to the absolute basics for those of us that are working in facilities that are implementing the Baby Friendly Initiative. So a disclosure, just to know that the images that I use in this presentation are for educational purposes, and they're not intended as promotional at all. I have no conflict of interest. So that you know who you're listening today, I am the co-director of the Baby Friendly Initiative Quality Improvement Project for Canada, and also a lead assessor, WHO UNICEF trained way back in 1992. So the code has been with me for a long time. All of you know that it's a very big topic. And what we're sharing today is just synthesizing stuff down to make it a bit more palatable for mere mortals like myself. So we'll just do our best to get to grips with a couple of things in the hour or so that we have together. Our objectives are to recognize the code, know the different names of it and what we're talking about when we are asked questions about the code, to be able to know what the code is and why it's important, and also to consider how we, in our own professional work and also in our institutions, wherever we may be, are able to implement those important tenets of the code. And in doing all of this, hopefully, we will raise awareness about what some common code violations are. So before we get started, what about the language? I'm really hoping that you're all going to feel comfortable to put stuff into the chat. And I'd like you, please, to participate as much as possible for the next hour. This is our opportunity to learn from and with each other. And so when you hear about the code or the WHO code, you know, are there other names? Do you know other names for this big topic? The WHO code, the code, anything else? The International Code of Marketing Breast Milk Substitutes. Any other things? I'm hoping you're all going to work with me today. So if you think of anything else, we can certainly bring in all the weird names that, as an assessor, I've heard over the years. It is a long title, the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. And then to add to that is, you know, the piece about the relevant regulations that go with it. But this is, there's many ways to talk about it. The language doesn't matter. Some people confuse the code with the Baby Friendly Initiative. And, you know, in Canada, we implement the code through the Baby Friendly Initiative. So it kind of all gets mixed up together. So let's try to get it a little bit sorted out in our minds. Well, what is it? And before we can talk about what the code is, or the WHO code or the marketing code, we need to understand why breastfeeding is important. And so in your chat, could you just put one reason why breastfeeding is important? Here in 2024, why is breastfeeding important? This is one of the questions, one of the fundamentals that we want all staff to know when we are implementing the BFI. So scratch around in your brain and think about why breastfeeding is important, and maybe put something in the chat. when we take a look at it and we dissect why breastfeeding is important today, we know that the scientific evidence base grows every day. We know about the impact of breast milk and breastfeeding, not only on infants, but also on their parents. We know about the extended benefit of increased breastfeeding rates for communities. We know how important it is that parents are given every piece of information that they need at the right time to be able to make the right decisions about infant feeding for themselves and their families. We know about the importance of breast milk, human milk, as perfect nutrition, optimal food. We know how it protects babies and children, and we know about the long-term life impacts that human milk feeding has on our population. And we also know that the World Health Organization and Health Canada have recommendations around how to protect, promote, and support breastfeeding, and that the implementation of guidelines or guardians like the International Code of Marketing are there to try to make sure that all families benefit from knowledge and expertise and informed decision making. We know it's much bigger than just an individual's decision on how they're going to feed their baby. We know that there are so many different things that impact our lives, that influence the decisions that we make in parenting, in how we're going to feed our babies. We have limitations, in terms of our policies and our regulations. We know that healthcare systems have varying standards. A lot of the time, we're not all dealing with the same deck of cards when it comes to protecting, promoting, and supporting breastfeeding. So we need to think about, why is it important that we value every drop of breast milk? Why do we make sure that we still teach prenatal education, that we fight so hard to make sure that we as healthcare workers in different scopes of practice are able to understand the value of breast milk, and why we keep on talking about it even in this day and age, and maybe especially in this day and age. The code is important because we know that there are risks to using breast milk substitutes. Anything that is manufactured by nature, anything that is manufactured is at risk for harm, whether we're speaking of the actual substitute food, the formula, the baby food, whatever that particular substance is that we're going to feed to young children, and also the way we feed it. So we're thinking about, implements, mixing, storage, clear directions in languages that people understand. All of that forms, quite a deck of things to think about when we are trying to protect and promote and support optimal health for children. So, when we look at some of the information that we have had over the years, the research has shown us that wherever breastfeeding rates decline, we have an increase in infant morbidity and mortality. So it tells us that, the more breast milk, the more breastfeeding that we can support in our society, the better the long-term health outcomes are for people. We have, less allergy, less contamination when breastfeeding is the norm. We have less infections, many kinds of infections. We have less malnutrition, and that's just looking at the infant impact. We also have research that shows us that there are many, many advantages to the breastfeeding parent. Lactation is protective. If we support the individual parent to lactate, to breastfeed, they have better long-term health outcomes too. So, and I think that we are aware much more today of this discourse. We know more. We're more able to access this the information. How we synthesize that and how we balance it up in the face of many conflicting sources of information and conflicting interests out there in the world, that's the battle that we have. As a new parent or an expectant parent, knowing how to sift through the valuable information to find what's going to work for you, what's factual and scientific information and sources that you can trust. That's the difficult part. So, the code is so important because it acknowledges the fact that we need to protect those infants who may not be exclusively breastfeeding, right? We need to understand that there are infants and children who are needing to be using breast milk substitutes for a variety of reasons. So how do we make sure that those children are safe, that their parents have adequate information to use those products in the safest possible way? Health Canada has acknowledges through various advisories, various statements, that there are risks to using infant formula and food substitutes, infant food substitutes. We know about the fact that powdered formula, for example, is not a sterile product. And so when it comes to those of us that do bedside care, understanding how to teach about the use of infant formula, the preparation and the storage, and the cue-based relationship that's needed between the parent and the child that we're feeding. These things are extremely important, and we need to be able to speak with as much confidence about breastfeeding as we are about the information that's needed for people who are not breastfeeding or who are partially breastfeeding. There's plenty of opportunity for us to do that teaching and to make sure that the teaching is not confused with promotion. We need to be able to give factual and scientific information. There's always room for contamination, there's room for incorrect preparation. Even from this factory source, we know that there's a potential for accidents to happen in terms of what goes into the recipe, for example, in making milk, or perhaps that some contaminant happens within the machinery, as we saw when the formula recalls happened over the last 18 months or so, sourced back to the factory where it was made. So Health Canada does warn us to be careful about, the use of powder infant formulas, to teach correctly so that all of our resources reflect that very important safety information. There's lots of opportunity for you if you are a bedside care provider to look for that information and to be able to do your guidance in the best correct way. We know that this is a big topic. We know that there are so many conflicting interests. Wherever we see a manufactured product of any kind, the interests of the shareholders, the stakeholders, the profit is the main driver in any industry. But when we consider the vulnerability of the population that is the recipient of a product like baby food, we realize how much more vigilant we need to be, not only as human practitioners, as individuals, but also in the realm of healthcare that we work, so that we can have an influence, we can be aware, we can make sure that we promote and we prompt our governments to have safeguards in place so that product has a high quality and that correct messages are being made available to parents about the product. So on this slide, you can see, some of the headlines of some of the issues that have happened with manufactured baby formula over the years, and we currently are still struggling with production, with sources of formula for our Canadian market. We know that we had a real problem at the beginning of the year with shortages, and it became an issue of food security for us here in Canada. And so our government is taking steps to try to tighten things up, and we need to be proactive and we need to be aware so that we see what's happening within our own country to protect and promote and support breastfeeding, and to be sure that all of the products that we might be needing at some point in time are well evidenced and well supported with legislation, so that we can be sure that we have the safest possible situation. What is the code when we think about this international code of marketing of breast milk substitutes? We know that it's not a new thing. We know that it goes way back to 1980s, the early 80s, where WHO recognized a crisis in infant feeding. Many places in the world, artificial feeding had become the fashion, and we saw an accompanying increase in sickness for infants and young child feeding. And so to respond to that, the member nations of the World Health Organization, after much consultation, the experts came together with this international code, which was intended to guide, to provide, recommendations to countries to put in place protections. So it's a tool for protecting breastfeeding primarily in all countries, not just underdeveloped countries, right? It protects all infants from the consequences of unethical marketing practices. It does not allow health claims, and we'll talk more a little bit later about what all of these things mean, but no health claims are allowed. And we have to be so alert and aware that there are no conflicts of interest when it comes to the use of these products. So, in 1981, this was adopted and was meant to be brought back to our country, i.e. Canada, and integrated into our healthcare system, into our rules and regulations, right? And in fact, in Canada, what we have are very few pieces of the code have made it into legislation. It is a voluntary code in Canada. It's not legislated as it is in some countries where it's, we are able to actually demand accountability from companies. It is not so much evident here in Canada. So the thing about the code is that it is a way to reduce harm to all families. It's not about whether you're breastfeeding or not breastfeeding. The aim of the code is to contribute to the provision of safe and adequate nutrition for infants by protecting and promoting breastfeeding, and by ensuring that the proper use of breast milk substitutes when necessary is in place, right, through appropriate marketing and distribution. Everybody okay? It's hard to see your faces with all the cameras off, so I'm hoping everyone is still with me at this point. So when we think about the code as harm reduction, and that it's for all families, and it's not just about formula, it's not just about breastfeeding, right? It's about the holistic approach to safe feeding of infants. The WHO code and its subsequent resolutions. So every second year or so at World Health Organization, they have an assembly, and they have on the agenda for meetings specific standing items. And one of them is the WHO code. And the WHO code, as it was drafted in 1981, has stayed the same. The strength and the evolution of the WHO code has come through those resolutions that come out of every second year when they have those meetings. So you'll remember, some of you, that the WHO code covers products that are fed to young infants originally, up to 6 months. And now it goes up to 3 years and beyond. The extended supports of the WHO resolutions recognizes that children are actually vulnerable for very much longer than 6 months, and it's quite complex, but at least we know that the scope is broadened. So, when we look at the WHO code, we see that the code looks at the marketing and the labeling of feeding products, what you can sell to people and how you sell it, how you promote it, what language you use, right? And the recipe, that the standard of the actual food is decided by a different group, by the Codex Alimentarius. They decide what goes into the formula. The code is the protective arm that deals with how it's advertised, how it is portrayed to the public who are making the decision to use that product. So you will see our labeling information there, and the label is a very powerful marketing tool. So it's important to recognize that, what the things that go on the label of a product are one of the biggest tools that the companies have for promoting their product. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So, we've got this regulation, this WHO code. We know that it's very important to protect all families. Who's responsible for it then, if it is not a legislated thing in Canada? So WHO at the Geneva Convention last year talked about who's got responsibility for implementing the code. And they talked about the fact that it's governments who legislate the code. That needs to be the topmost goal, is to have governments that actually see the value of putting into legislation the code, because we're dealing with, multi-million-dollar corporations that have great power. We need to understand that the manufacturers themselves also have responsibility to abide by the code. They were part of the very initial discussions around what such a code should look like way back in the 80s. There was a strong contingent representation from industry sitting around the table to discuss with those members from the WHO what should a code of marketing look like. So they do have that responsibility. And in Canada, that responsibility is loaded heavily onto the actual manufacturers. Our healthcare systems and us as the healthcare workers in all our different roles, we have a responsibility too. Because if you think about families and where they place their trust, we know that if a family is coming to us for care, or they cycle through, our places of work, we have contact with them, they trust the healthcare system. So, what we do in our practice, how we model our practice, the information and the resources that we provide to families holds great weight. So we need to make sure that we actually are bringing to the table the right information, the right skills, and the right attitudes to be able to empower families to make important, informed decisions about how they're going to feed their babies. And as a general public, you and I who are in the healthcare system directly are also the general public, right? So we need the information, the awareness, the ability to transfer that theoretical knowledge of what the code is and why breastfeeding is important into our everyday discussions, relationships with family and friends and everyone else as we will walk through life. So it's everybody's responsibility, right? When we think a little bit deeper about our own situation, this little talk is aimed for those of us that are working within either hospitals or public health units. We work with health authorities of some kind. And it is the health authorities that are responsible for taking appropriate measures to encourage and protect breastfeeding and to promote the principles of the code. Those two things go together. When we talk about, why breastfeed to prenatal class, for example, we have to be able to show what is the impact, what is the importance of breastfeeding, and what are the risks of not breastfeeding, right? Everybody needs to understand the benefits, the risks, the alternatives, how to trust your intuition, how to seek for information, when and how to make the best decisions, and how to give yourself the flexibility to find resources and to be able to change that decision at some point if that is the situation that arises. So in terms of our healthcare system, we are prohibited from promoting products. We are not prohibited from the use of products within our realm, right? but it's the promotion of the products that is the main core of the scope of the code. The healthcare workers are required to make themselves familiar with their responsibilities under the code. So that becomes the piece of the puzzle that we're trying to untangle today. What is our responsibility under the code? Do we have a responsibility if I am, at very arm's length from the maternal child unit in the hospital, if I don't directly work with parents, for example, if I happen to be working in administration in a big healthcare facility, then what is my responsibility? I just want to make sure that everybody's muted here for a second. Otherwise, we'll all be having problems. I think we're okay now. Is everyone okay? The code is the worst thing, isn't it? So please chip in. I would love to see things in the chat as we go along. Please feel like you can write stuff in there. I see that there are some things in the chat. And we will investigate those chats a little bit more. I just want to make sure that you're all with me at the moment. Good. I see lots of good things written in that chat, and I'm sure you can too. So, who is responsible for the code? What is my responsibility for the code? These are the kinds of things that we are trying to sift through today. So how do we do that? We think about our situation in terms of what policies support my institution, what policies support my work. But then I also am thinking about myself, my own professional ethics. In the specific work that you do, what are your professional ethics? What is your responsibility? How much do you need to know? How much trouble do you need to go to inform yourself so that you can be that trusted source of information for parents when they're trying to make decisions? So as healthcare workers, we are not allowed to accept free products or samples or services from companies that produce breast milk substitutes, right? We're not allowed to accept gifts or incentives, things like insurance policies or think about the monetary benefits that companies used to offer. Oftentimes, the higher up the healthcare system you go, the bigger the incentives are. Golfing weekends or holidays in exotic places, or perhaps, money to support your children at a university, to attend conferences. Those kinds of things are completely common in the corporate world. As ethical practitioners, we are not allowed to accept those kinds of incentives. And as members of a community of workers within a facility, whether that's a private practice or it's a hospital or a public health unit, we should not allow ourselves and our institutions to be used to promote products. So no commercial events should be held there, and we shouldn't be distributing gifts or coupons to caregivers or families, new families, no free samples, right? And we should not allow companies, corporate bodies, to be providing education directly or indirectly, either to ourselves or to the families that we deal with. Right? Education about using the product should come without promotional material. It should be scientific and factual and given to families by people who are looking at the holistic outcome, the greater good for that family. What do you need to know within your circumstances about the use of a product when it needs to be used? So to allow companies to sponsor healthcare professional meetings and to be able to come into your facility to provide information sessions to the staff or to the patients or the clients is not an ethical stance to take. So let's think about that. How do we keep the promotion out of it when we do sometimes need to use these products? Right? It's not the product that's the problem here in the code context. It's the promotion of that product. And the fact that so much advertising equalizes or tends to aim to equalize, breast milk and formula, for example, are equivalent. This is not factual or scientific information, right? So we need to think about how we are manipulated. We know that what is covered by the scope of the code, if you think of it simply, anything that you feed to a child who's less than 6 months old, and when they are most milk is the foundation of their diet. And we know WHO says that the recommendation is that we breastfeed exclusively for the first 6 months of life around, and then we continue to provide breast milk breastfeeding for 2 years and beyond. That's based on physiology, right? Those recommendations. So you can look at this scope of the code as any food or drink that you feed to children that would take the place of breast milk, right? So it could be formula, it's juices, it's teas, it's cereals, it's baby food, purees, cookies, all those kinds of things, if they are marketed for children who are less than 6 months old, right? And there's a much broader interpretation to 3 years and beyond now, which is out of the scope of this little talk. We're thinking most focus on that less than 6-month-old child. So, that covers a lot of ground, right? So the code does not ban formula or bottles and teats. That it's not a ban on those things. What it is it's a demand that there is researched information, scientific information that goes with them when they need to be used, right? Scientific and factual information. No marketing inducements, right? So we want to make sure that we understand that this code is there to protect breastfeeding and formula feeding families. Think about the risks that are involved around artificial feeding. And we have to just think from a common sense perspective, what might those risks be? If you are living anywhere in Canada, are there risks to artificial feeding? Do we have safe water supplies? Do we have a population that can everybody afford to formula feed, right? What does that cost look like? So you're thinking not only about the safety, the sustainability, right? The availability of the product. Look how difficult it was to obtain formula within Canada in the last little while, right? We've had some pretty big lessons to be learned about food security in the recent past. So do we have risk situations in our own country, in our own city, in our own facilities, in the population base that we serve? If you can identify any of those risks, right, then we need to understand the value of the code. So when we think about messaging, we look at advertising and we realize just from this one example how clever advertising is. And that goes for any kind of advertising, but we're thinking about food for the most vulnerable here, right? So just looking at this one example, one of the biggest tools in advertising is to appeal to the emotion, isn't it? So beautiful pictures, we think about our right brain behavior and all of those warm fuzzy feelings that we get by looking at beautiful pictures. The right sort of colors are important. Here's this lovely expectant parent sitting there. It's that dream building time where you're imagining, you're building in your heart and in your brain your expectations for this life that's coming. And of course, we have this product that's number one chosen by most pediatric hospitals, or the product most often recommended by your physician. We appeal then to the intellect and we say it will build your child's brain. It will, support their immune system. These things are health claims. They are promises that Health Canada, in their Food and Drugs Act, says there should be no health claims. You cannot make claims that cannot be substantiated by really good research, right? When you look at the cost savings there, oh, we're going to give you, this wonderful product, and we're going to give you a monetary incentive to go with it. When you look at the fine print on the bottom there, this brand can help do da, 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 a whole lot of different health benefits. And you can get a freebie and you can get ongoing discounts. So we're looking at the emotional tie, the financial tie, we're looking at the intellectual tie there, and of course, that trust tie. If this is the product that they're giving to me when my baby needs it in hospital, when my newborn is being supplemented, perhaps for a medical reason, then it must be the best product if my hospital is choosing to use that brand, right? So one of the things that we learn to say when parents ask us, is that the facility uses that product when necessary simply because it's the cheapest. It's the one that met the RFP, the request for sourcing of information, for sourcing of product. We know that there's not one formula that's better than another. Health Canada tells us that. WHO tells us that they all have to meet a minimum standard for manufacturing and processing. So for parents, they need to know, really, if our hospital is using formula, they have to pay for it. If it's a baby-friendly hospital, they put out a request for purchase, and we see where we get the best deal, right? That's the only reason why they use it. If you are not a baby-friendly hospital and you're getting that formula for free, then you need to tell parents the only reason we use this brand is because we're getting it for free, right? Not because it's better than any other, for sure. So, that's just looking at this one little example very briefly from a very surface perspective. It's all about that emotional appeal. And we are so vulnerable to that, particularly during pregnancy and in the early years. Every parent wants to do the very best they can for their children. So that presentation is powerful. When we look at misleading claims from formula companies, it can become very confusing, right? We're trying to make sure that we protect people from unethical marketing strategies. That's what the code is doing. It's all about the marketing, right? We should not be having a situation that creates a conflict of interest for our healthcare providers. So if you are, a physician and your office has got a closet in it that's filled with free samples, if the rep visits you constantly and brings donuts and coffee and goodness knows what else, because that's just the tip of the iceberg very often, with the best will in the world, sometimes physicians don't have time to engage with these people, and it's not them who do, it's perhaps their reception staff that deal with the reps, right, who may not know how important they are in their role as gatekeepers. Right, so we need to understand that if you are giving out free samples, if you are taking free samples from reps, for example, if you're wearing the lanyard with the product name on it, without realizing that you're a walking advertisement, if you are attending free seminars that are paid for by companies that fall under the scope of the code, you are cementing a relationship with that particular company. And it does affect the way we see their products and the way we speak about their products if we accept these kinds of incentives from them. And Health Canada has tried very hard in the small amount of reach that they have allowed for the code. We see that in the Food and Drugs Act, there's a prohibition against labeling that implies that a product is suitable for infants less than 6 months old. And we also know that the labeling of any food should make sure that there's no mistake about about that. So if you look at a tin of formula or cereal, if it says it should be, used for children under 6 months old, that is very questionable for marketing, right? It's not supposed to be done that way. Looking at the way we're presented with information, this is one of the most classical examples of how we can use marketing imaging to sway our social norms. If you just look at that picture, you see the equivalence being created between breast and bottle, breast and formula, right? They are not the same thing, right? So we need to keep in our minds separate the information about what is breast milk, what is its impact, what is formula, what is its impact, what are the benefits, what are the risks, what are the alternatives, what information do you need to make a decision? And then we should, as a healthcare system, we need to be able to support families no matter what decision they've made, as long as it's based on scientific and factual information. No longer can we say, breast is the best thing to feed your baby, and then there's no support for people who want to do just that. And we know that within Canada, we have a really high initiation of breastfeeding rate, but there's quite a fast drop-off over the next couple of months. And it's because there's so much equivalence placed, there's so much accessibility for formula, we don't really work hard enough to support parents so that when the need is there, the need is reduced, because we've done such a good job of supporting, so the need becomes minimal, right? So thinking a little bit about the ways that we're influenced, when you look at this slide, the days of marketing strategies have changed so dramatically, especially over the last 10 years or so. When we look at how things used to be advertised, how parents were reached, we used to have things like welcome wagons in hospitals. We used to have representatives from companies coming to give cooking classes in public health institutions. Way back, we had not really much idea of how much we were being manipulated. With knowledge comes power and responsibility, right? You see on this slide images on cans. We see pages taken out of magazines that glamorize and appeal to the emotional brain. That top right-hand picture there that advertises a particular bottle, it reinforces that desire for everyone to be able to have quality time with the baby, because you can only really have quality time with your baby if you're feeding it, or what. So, all of these kinds of messages, no pain, more gain, breastfeeding is painful, use this product and it's much easier, solutions, beautiful images of babies that appeal to the emotions. This product's going to make your child smart. This one's going to make your child sleep through the night. These are health claims that are not supported by evidence, and they are used to sell product because they appeal to tired parents. When we look at that far left-hand corner, you can see a display in a gift shop. And that display just really brings home the fact that in our society, our social concept of of how we feed babies is bottle feeding. Even if you look at some of the signage in airports, for example, there's a bottle as a symbol for a place where you can go and feed your baby. You see bumper stickers on cars, baby on board stickers that have got a bottle as the symbol. So it has become such a social norm, right? It's very difficult sometimes for parents to be able to make that distinction that there's two different products and two different processes. The most invasive and the most powerful means of influencing our thought today is social media, isn't it? And if you think I think about myself as, you know, somebody who's, retiring from a lifetime of work. And I think about my non-technical brain. And I think about the amount of time I spend on social media. I'm quite shocked at myself. Even simple things like following your children's antics on, X media or Y media opens you up to floods and floods of advertising and messages of all sorts of things of different types. And was a point that was brought to the international gathering that was held in Geneva last year, the Code Congress, where many days were spent looking at the intricacies of the code and the way marketing ploys have changed. And the biggest threat is the artificial intelligence that is brought to our technology to be able to identify where our interests lie, what our age groups are, what our social norms look like, and to be able to bombard our screen time with specific messages, reinforcing all the time. One link leads to another link leads to another link, and the depth of the reach is extreme. So that, this is something we need to be aware of. Where do parents go for information about infant feeding? Where do they go to? What sites are trusted sites to get information if you are trying to breastfeed your baby, or if you are formula feeding your baby? Where do you go for trustworthy information about that? That's not all about buy this product. Oh no, there's a better one that you can get if you go down this rabbit hole. And oh no, this one looks as though it's much more scientific. And this one is going to cost me less because look, I can collect all these freebies. And so the world is busy and confusing, and it's quite threatening, especially if I put myself in the position of new parents today. There is so much influence, and it's not all benign influence, and that is the main thing that we need to recognize. So, when we think a little bit more about what is our role, it's recognizing, it's being able to alert ourselves to possible influences. What sort of things are creeping into our work life that could possibly be promotional? Do we want to be responsible for promoting product? This was one of the most powerful strategies that formula companies had going way back when they started flooding maternity facilities with free formula. And they did that all over the world to great detriment in some countries of some children. But when a hospital particularly, or a health unit or a medical practitioner hands out a sample of milk or recommends a particular brand, it must be the best if my healthcare system is using it. And that's the thing that we have to remember with baby friendly is facilities that are ethically responsible. They are not promoting product. They're also not accepting product for free, right? We don't give free formula in terms of, take home packs. But that doesn't mean that we're not using formula in the hospital. Yes, we can use formula in the hospital, but we're not sending people home with gift packs and coupons and bags full of promotional material, right? We've way past that phase. We've learned so much better. We don't want to have relationships that come out of accepting freebies with entities that are as powerful and influential as multi-corporate manufacturing, advertising entities. So, I know that the code can be really overwhelming. It can be very boring. It can be completely out of my realm to understand all the intricacies of the code. But, over a lifetime of working with baby friendly, you start to realize that, okay, where does this all fit into what we can do? What can we do? We can work at a political level, at an activist level. We can work at an individual level by how we practice. We can make sure we are guardians of the arena that we live and work in terms of being alert. And I thought that, to put it in a nutshell, I would share with you this little video that was made by in Ontario, because it really reminds us of how the code fits into this big picture of the Baby Friendly Initiative. And it boils it down to some very, very minimal basics. And when we've watched the video, we'll discuss a little bit about some examples of how we can make the code work within our own job.
There's no sound.
Can someone give me a thumbs up if you can hear okay?
There's no sound.
Okay, that's what I was worried about. There's always got to be something that happens, isn't it? No. Please give me a minute while you work on your chat and think about, in your particular job, what is your job and how does the code pertain to you? And I will try to get the sound working here. Come on, speakers.
Kathy, when you hit share, did it share the computer audio as well? You'll just have to click that on.
I'll try share one more time, but I am knowing that that thing is a problem. Let's see. I always have guardian angels helping me with this stuff. Let's see, we'll try again. Thank you for your patience, everyone. Let me know now, please, Danielle.
We can hear it.
Breast milk is the natural food for a baby and is all that a baby needs for the first 6 months. In the past, mothers continued to breastfeed their children for several years. How is breastfeeding important for babies? The World Health Organization, Health Canada, Dietitians of Canada, and the Canadian Pediatric Society recommend breastfeeding for babies and toddlers exclusively for the first 6 months and sustained for up to 2 years or longer with appropriate complementary feeding. Breastfeeding should continue even after other foods are introduced. It promotes good health and protects children from lots of diseases. It helps their brains develop and helps with good dental development. As a baby grows, breast milk changes to meet the needs of babies. How is breastfeeding important for mothers? Breastfeeding is important for mothers because it helps the mother feel confident and relaxed. Mothers who breastfeed recover more quickly from childbirth and have a decreased risk for some types of cancers and type 2 diabetes. Breast milk is convenient, always at the right temperature and available anytime. How is breastfeeding supported in Canada? The Baby Friendly Initiative, or the BFI, is a worldwide program that protects, promotes, and supports breastfeeding. It is based on research to have the best immediate and long-term outcomes for mothers, babies, and future generations. The Baby Friendly Initiative helps women to breastfeed successfully and to continue to breastfeed longer. How can the Baby Friendly Initiative benefit mothers and babies? It ensures that mothers receive the help and information they need to breastfeed. It supports mothers to make an informed decision about infant feeding and ensures that mothers who are formula feeding are informed about how to safely prepare, feed, and store formula. Why is the baby-friendly initiative important? Families, mothers, and babies will receive evidence-based information and consistent support to breastfeed well. This gives the baby and mother the best start as they learn together. Healthcare providers will have the knowledge and experience to help with breastfeeding challenges. Breastfed babies get sick less often, and breastfeeding helps families save money. What does baby-friendly mean for healthcare organizations? The Baby Friendly Initiative supports both breastfeeding and formula feeding families. The Baby Friendly Initiative makes sure that all staff have the necessary education and skills to implement the 10 steps based on their role in the organization. The Baby Friendly Initiative protects families from formula advertising and prevents healthcare providers from promoting particular brands. How can healthcare organizations support the Baby Friendly Initiative? There are 10 steps to becoming baby-friendly. Healthcare organizations will work on these steps to achieve baby-friendly designation. 1. Facilities will have a breastfeeding policy that staff and volunteers are aware of to support mothers to breastfeed as long as they wish. 2. Ensure that staff get up-to-date, ongoing training to implement the breastfeeding policy and support all families. 3. Pregnant women will get information about the importance and process of breastfeeding. 4. Support all mothers to have uninterrupted skin-to-skin contact immediately after the birth of their baby for at least 1 hour until completion of the first feeding or as long as the mother wishes. 5. Help mothers to breastfeed and support them if they have difficulties. 6. Support mothers to breastfeed without giving other foods and drinks for the first 6 months, unless supplements are medically needed. 7. Support mothers and babies being together both day and night while in hospital and at home. 8. Encourage cue-based feeding. All mothers will learn how to tell when their baby is hungry. Breastfeeding will be encouraged and supported for 2 years or more. 9. Support mothers to breastfeed their babies without using artificial bottle nipples or soothers. 10. Community health services and hospitals will work together to best support mothers. Mothers will also be told about mother-to-mother support programs. Healthcare organizations also need to adopt the WHO code, part of the Baby Friendly Initiative, which protects all families from the influence of advertising and marketing of infant formula and feeding products. The WHO code prevents the promotion or giving of formula, bottles, or pacifiers by the organization. This includes samples or coupons for such products too. Baby-friendly designation is achieved after a formal assessment process by a BFI assessment team from the Breastfeeding Committee for Canada. What are some ways healthcare organizations can get started on their baby-friendly journey? Assemble a team that includes management, nurses, doctors, midwives, community health workers, clerical staff, community members, and mothers. Work through the Baby Friendly Initiative 10 Steps and WHO Code Outcome Indicators for Hospitals and Community Health Services document. Remember that the Baby Friendly Initiative supports all families. The steps do not need to be implemented in any specific order. Take it one step at a time. Start with something small and build on your successes. Celebrate your successes along the way. Connect with others and learn how they're implementing each step.
Thank you to the BFI strategy who made that little video so many years ago now, but it is still very pertinent, and I think it puts it in a nutshell. If we know the information provided in that little video, most of us would be able to do a really good assessment interview if your facility is going through assessment, because the nitty-gritties are in there, right? We have to have the knowledge and the attitude and the skills to be able to support families. And that goes for any part of the healthcare system that we work in. And when we look at what is the most critical basic kernels of knowledge about something like the WHO code, which is part of the 10 steps, right? The WHO code falls under step 1 of the 10 steps. You know, we need to know what is the purpose of the WHO code. So if you could just put it into one sentence, would you be able to answer that question? What is the code for? Can you name 2 products that are covered by the code? How does your healthcare facility implement the code? And how do you, abide by the code in your own work, in your own profession as a human member of our society? How does the code sit in your own heart? Are we aware of this big issue that the code tries to amplify for us in our thought processes? If I was to ask you right now to just say what is the purpose of the code in your own mind, what would you say? Please don't be shy to open your mic up if you want to just say something. I will definitely share the links. I'm going to give you some resources at the end of this. I'm just looking at what's in the chat. But somebody's put here, protects families from aggressive marketing. Definitely. It's very simple. It's about protecting against unethical or aggressive marketing. Thank you. Could you name 2 products, just off the top of your head, if the code covers things that would replace breastfeeding or breast milk? What 2 products could you bring to mind? Formula, bottles, cereals. Yeah, anything you would feed to babies, right? That might take the place or displace breastfeeding or breast milk. So now here's a harder one. How does your facility, let's pretend for a minute that we're all working in a public health setting. How do you, as a public health unit, for example, or a family practice, for example, how do you make sure that you implement the code? If you work in public health, how do you make sure that your facility is implementing the code? We're not accepting promotional items like beautiful posters. Even the growth charts that we have in our clinic rooms for kids, that's a very common way that companies promote their brands. They send the physicians and the nurse practitioners and places like that these beautiful, glossy, full-sized growth charts or weigh-scale covers with their logos on them, right? Or donations of things. What about donations of things like formula samples, or perhaps nipple creams, or things that are not really about food, but the company comes along with all their brochures, perhaps about their new line of formula, and they bring a basket full of little sachets of nipple cream for the parents. Those kinds of things. Making sure that there's no marketing flyers in your waiting rooms, for example. You know, that's the way we can maintain the code. If you have to keep some formula within your facility for emergency use, is it locked away? Is it out of sight? Is there control over who has access to that? And when it's used, is there always the information that goes with it? And the support pieces for the breastfeeding relationship, are they there at the same time? Most of you are putting in really interesting strategies for ensuring you're meeting the code. So I can see that this group is very educated in code issues already. So, you know, if you were a hospital, it's really and truly about, you know, being able to say to parents who ask you the question about, you know, what brand are you using in this facilities, to be able to say exactly as I mentioned before, you know, we use this brand because it came in at the best price, right? That is a really good way. If your child needs a specialty formula, that discussion should be had with the dietitian or the neonatologist or the physician, right? We know what we need to say. We also know that we're not going to have, you know, storage cupboards standing open with, you know, all the products that we could possibly use in our facility on open display, because that's promotion. It influences families, you know. So I think it's quite simple. And when you're on the spot and you're doing your assessment interview and the assessor asks you, you know, how does your facility implement the code? Well, the thing is, we know that you will have somewhere a breastfeeding policy. And if you're working on baby friendly, that policy includes the code. So, you know, if you've done any education around baby friendly, if you've done education around breastfeeding, that would have included information about marketing and the code. So you can easily find two ways that the healthcare facility you work for is implementing the code. They're educating their staff and they're making sure that their policies abide by the code. You know, how do you, as a human person, how do you abide by the code? You know, it is so much to think about when it comes down to the individual, right? Pat Martins, the researcher who's passed and left us with a great legacy of awareness around these issues. She always used to ask groups the question, that famous question, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, you know, how would you answer this question? And the question was, there's a real health difference between babies or children who are breastfed and children who are formula fed, or something to that effect. And on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel? Where do you fit? Are you very much in agreement that, you know, that there's a big difference, or are you very much in agreement that really there's no difference? Or do you sit somewhere in the middle? And the interesting thing is that, speaking personally, as I look back, you know, or on a day-to-day basis, depending on what's happening in my life at the time, you could shift along that spectrum. You could be more convinced sometimes than other times, depending on what's happening in your life and in your work, right? The key thing that comes out of asking that question is, you know, is that piece that says, if you are ambivalent as a healthcare person, if you sit on the fence about this, then that comes across, that ambivalence comes across as negative to breastfeeding, according to Jane Martin's years of research. So as a healthcare professional, we need to do our work to know as much as we can, and to be able to recognize our own personal experiences and biases, perhaps, that influence the way we think. And then to be able to come to the professional table and say, you know, I can give you information about this, and I can support you and point you to resources. How you decide to feed your baby and what decisions you make, those are your decisions. My job is to give you science and information that is practical and supportive and respectful, you know. I'm watching the chat and seeing really lovely comments going in here. There's a nice comment as well about mental health nurses often go to the first intervention to help you sleep through the night by chucking out the night feeds. So that's an interesting piece there, because just as there are medical indications for supplementing babies at times, there may be medical indications for parents to be replacing or supplementing breastfeeding in different circumstances. The thing is, how do we work within that individual's circumstances while we still support the breastfeeding relationship as much as possible to optimize the outcomes, the goals that that person has? How do we help them meet their goal within the constraints of biology and the social determinants of health and everything else that informs how we live our life through? How do we still treasure those drops of breast milk, or those days or weeks or months of the breastfeeding relationship, even though all sorts of other stuff might be happening as well? The thing I need to tell myself all the time is that this is such an important relationship. It is truly a relationship, a social entity that's the priority. Protect it, right? Every drop counts. There's no too little breast milk to make it a valuable exercise, right? So whatever, you meet people where they're at, you support them, you give them information, and you treasure the drops, because then there's optimism and empowerment and the will and the ability to meet your own goals. Scientific evidence shows formula feeding moms don't sleep more than breastfeeding moms, and that's true. You know, a lot of the things about infants, particularly that we connect with what we're feeding them, is actually the way we try to rationalize infant behavior. You know, kids are gassy for the first 3 months of life. Doesn't matter what you feed them, right? They will sleep through the night when they are neurologically mature enough to do so, not before that. And we have great research and great resources that help us with that. But when you're a very tired parent, or you're overwhelmed, or you're confused, you know, that's when we look for quick fixes to things. And, you know, being able to actually do something like switch out the type of food is very appealing when you're a bit desperate and lacking in sleep. You know, so it's that it boils down to those basics of, you know, informed decision making. Give people the tools so that they can make the best decisions. But then we need tools too, as healthcare workers, to be able to support them in whatever they decide they're going to do. We need to think hard about, you know, in my own job, what is my responsibility? You know, if I happen to be the phlebotomist, you know, the person working in the lab doing those occasional babies that might need jaundice, bloods taken for jaundice, for example, or low blood sugars, or whatever the case may be, you know, how do I support the code there? Can you think of a way that that person, that lab technician, perhaps might be able to respect the code? You know, think about the person who is administrative support in a facility. How does that individual be able to support the code? You know, it's being vigilant, it's being able to be aware of influences, it's being, you know, positive about breastfeeding generally. Those are the ways that we can, you know, in some way live the code. Allowing babies to breastfeed for blood work to reduce pain. Absolutely. Follow best practice. You know, retrieve the blood by letting mom breastfeed. Yes, you all baby friendly for sure. The nuances of the code become complicated, right? There's so much more to it than my small role as a nurse or a lactation consultant, or the mother of a new of someone who's just had a baby. You know, as a grandmother, what is my role? You know, how do I protect, promote, and support? How do I stay on the alert for potentially negative influences? You know, those are the things that we can do. So, you know, what are the do's and the don'ts for us? Do be aware of our own ethical stance, you know, recognize our own biases, respect and value our own varied experiences with feeding babies. It's not always roses. You know, many of us have regrets. We wished we'd known then what we know now. But being able to value the relationship above all else, you know, so that whatever happens, that the family hangs in there together and that the baby is fed well, that the parents meet their breastfeeding goals, and that they're protected from influences that are not helpful. We need to provide information that's factual and scientific. We need to respect the informed decision that's made by families, and we need to question industry involvement in our own education, the conferences we go to, the research opportunities that come our way. You know, do we have conflicts of interest? Don't accept free products. Don't accept, you know, incentives or sponsorships. And don't allow yourself to be used as a pimp for any product, not just infant feeding products. And most of all, when, you know, giving a freebie, giving a 6-pack to go home with, or a little stash of something, it might last for a day or a few days, but a greater gift would be connecting that family with sustainable source of the product. You know, if a child needs formula, then we need to make sure the family can access it, you know, in the most accessible, safe, sustainable situation needs to be created for food security, right? And all the time celebrating every drop, every effort that the mother makes to get food into babies. I'm looking at the chat. Can you speak to the increased use of pumps? So, you know, that's a big can of worms, isn't it, Lisa? Thank you ever so for asking that question. But the thing about pumps, you know, is that they fall very often into that gray area. You know, the code covers not only infant formula and breast milk substitutes, but it also covers feeding bottles and that kind of equipment too, because it's not only the breast milk substitute, which is different from breast milk, but it's the delivery system as well, which can completely change the relationship with food. You know, it's very often that interference at just the wrong time in terms of learning how to relate to food, learning how to feed your baby, that can really derail the breastfeeding attempt of a family that wants to breastfeed. So pumps fall into that gray area. Pumps by necessity, you know, you think about, okay, I'm going to pump my milk, and then how am I going to feed that pumped milk to my baby? So that whole gray area of, you know, pumps and the way they advertise their product, you know, does their advertising make it look as though pumping is much more desirable than the relationship of breastfeeding? Sometimes we need pumps. There's no denying that, right? Sometimes there's a choice not to breastfeed babies for whatever reason. But for the most part, when we look at our cultural shift towards pumping, we see that starts, you know, in our context, looking at the American experience where maternity benefits are very poor, where you might need to be back to work just at the 6-week mark when we know lactation is just getting sorted out, that without pumps, to go back to work with a lot of babies wouldn't get breast milk past that point. That's where it comes from, right? And then that whole myth around pumping, you won't have enough milk if you don't pump. But, you know, the nature of the advertising and promotion of those opportunities or options sometimes interferes with the common understanding of what is breastfeeding, right? So, you know, we could go on for ages. We could have a big discussion about the place of pumps in today's world of lactation. But in terms of the code, indeed, they do fall under the scope of the code. And there are pump companies that are almost more unethical than some of the formula companies. So we need to be vigilant and see that they do find opportunities to give messages that make it more likely that people will bottle feed and formula feed. Okay, so there's lots of experts opportunities in the bigger world that will dig deep into the code, the nuances of the code, conflicts of interest, the policies and the politics, and the regulatory bodies that need to change things in our Canadian context to make sure that the marketing influences the production and manufacturing, and the marketing and the promotion and the influence of multinationals in our policy making bodies. There's huge ethical discussions that can be had. 1 hour of basics around the code is not enough to do that deep dive, but hopefully just the intention is just to prick an awareness within each of us that we're all responsible for the awareness to prevent the messaging, the promotion, inadvertently sometimes through our work, so that we can help to make the world a bit of a better place when parents are exposed to so much different stuff. And to be able to say, oh, I don't know about that, but let's go and find someone who can give us better answers. That's a real sign of a true professional with great ethics. We don't all have to know everything. The code is a lifetime study, and legal brains at high level still don't agree on all the things around the code. So in our world, in the baby-friendly world that we are working this in, let's think about the 10 steps and why the code is embedded into step 1, along with the policy piece and the education of staff, so that we have the equipment necessary, that we can go into our jobs almost with a cloak of invisibility, so that we can not fall into the trap and be accused of unethical practices because we are unsuspectingly being used by companies to promote product. So in the chat, you'll see a lot of links popping up. Mac from Quebec has great website that talks in depth about the code in very beautiful detail. The Safely Fed Canada has wonderful programs and opportunities, so I would encourage you to go into their websites and their opportunities to get educated more. If you go and have a look at our website, the Breastfeeding Committee for Canada has a page on the code that looks in very, very basic terms at, where you can find resources, how you can take action within Canada to support the code. There's so much excellent stuff out there. And especially if you need, Francophone interpretation of these things, go and have a look at Mac's website. They've done extremely excellent work, and their resources are most helpful. So if you look at the BCC website, you'll find a whole page of resources. And thanks, Leah has put the page up there into the chat. So there's also a few other things on that list. We have made Jeopardy games. Thank you, Mark Lassalle. Created Jeopardy game that you can use for any level of staff, that not only talks about the code, but also lots of the information about each of the 10 steps. So you can have a fun way of just brushing up on what you know about baby friendly. So there's lots of stuff out there for us to have a look at. There's also many WHO resources. They're all on those pages. So please take some time and go and have a look. What I'm going to do is plonk into the chat an evaluation form, because honestly, knowing our limitations of time, we really want to make sure that you get an opportunity to just say what you would like to see as continuing education. We're trying to give you what you asked for, and that was something very simple in this instance, with the hope that you will go and hunt further for more in-depth information. So